Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
My name is Shelly Tochluk. I am the author of Witnessing Whiteness, The Journey into Racial Awareness and Anti-Racist Action. And I am going to kick it off by reading the very first page of the introduction to this new edition of the book. Is there something you can do about the title? Witnessing Whiteness doesn't feel like enough. Things have changed. A white man offered this assessment during a 2021 focus group that asked readers to provide feedback on the second edition of the book in preparation for the third. He's correct about the altered terrain. Times have changed since the second edition's 2010 publication. Since that time, the global Black Lives Matter movement emerged and strengthened as law enforcement and the criminal justice system failed to end police violence against Black people. Backlash against racial justice efforts erupted. The nation faced the amplification of white nationalism and the unleashing of overt white supremacy. Throughout these years, white racial identity politics explicitly and frequently headlined national news, often focusing on anti-immigrant nativism. Enhanced voter suppression efforts across the nation targeted congressional districts with majority-minority voters, particularly affecting Black and Indigenous communities. Coordinated media-fueled anti-critical race theory efforts swept the nation. With partisan echo chambers entrenched and social media influence expanded exponentially, the national conversation on race evolved as the nation itself appeared to falter. Given all of this, it makes logical sense for people to believe that we have all collectively witnessed enough, that the only thing left to do is to do something, to act. After all, what more can be said? What more do we need to witness? White people only witnessing is part of the problem, right? Sort of. Witnessing our whiteness was never enough, even back in 2010. The previously published preface to this book opened with a statement that said as much. At the same time, white people continue to need the support this book offers because learning how to do something is confusing for most white people. Coming to awareness and embarking on a racial identity journey is not easy or obvious. This reality remains unchanged. If anything, the fact that more and more white people are paying attention and want to be part of racial justice is why this book remains relevant. It provides a supportive bridge for those who care but do not yet understand all of what it means to be anti-racist today. Witnessing our whiteness remains a necessary step on the road to collective and effective anti-racist action.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I am excited you guys are joining us today. We're going to have a fabulous discussion about a very, very prevalent topic that we're facing today with this amazing author. Hello, Miss Shelly. How are you today?
I am well. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so thrilled. When you first contacted me, I looked at the title and I'm like, that's an interesting topic. Okay, what is this going to be about? So I am so excited you're here because this is a conversation that is being had everywhere. But at the same time, where do we start? How do we have this conversation without making people feel uncomfortable or going, do we really go there? So the topic is amazing, but let's get into what made you create this book?
I had no intention of writing a book. I never had any intention of writing a book originally. What happened is that I went through a process. I went through my own awakening process that was started by people who cared about me enough to say, hey, you're actually creating some challenges in the location where you're working. I'm here with you and I want you to do better. And I was not accepting of that information very readily, very quickly. It took a while for me to really understand what they were talking about. I had all the same sort of defensive reactions that a lot of people do because I was an elementary school teacher and I thought I was doing good work. I really thought my heart was all in it and I had good education. And so I'm here trying to be helpful. So why are you giving me pushback? I clearly care about all of the kids. And thankfully, I did start taking people seriously. I started learning about myself more. It changed the trajectory of my life completely. And I ended up moving on to do another academic degree program. And thankfully, I chose the kind of program that allowed me to pick something that I cared about to do a dissertation on. The dissertation that I did was focused on race. It was focused on how do I understand what this has all meant for me to wake up to being a person who is white, who accepts that I identify as white. And so how does that place me within history? How does that place me within the world today? Because I wanted to be a healthy person doing a good job with things. What ultimately happened is after the dissertation was done, somebody said, there's a book hiding within this dissertation somewhere. And I had such a hard time getting from where I started to where I had landed that it became clear that there was room for a book that was going to help people make that transition, because I firmly believe that it doesn't need to be as long and drawn out and difficult as it was for me. Now, all of this happened in the early 2000s. So we're going back a couple of decades now.
It's interesting because we're talking about the early 2000s. Yes, it's a couple of decades, but it's not that long ago.
Right.
But how much things have changed because of time and everything that we have faced, and how much are people becoming much more awakened and much more willing to open? When you first wrote the book that you bringing this to the forefront, what did people said? Because this is something that wasn't talked about 2 decades ago.
That's absolutely right. The very first edition of this book was published in 2007. And at the time, there was very little that white people were talking to other white people about, hey, let's look at what it means to be part of the race that we are. We were very much in sort of a cultural milieu of let's be colorblind. And then just a couple of years later, it was, oh, and now we're transcending race because Obama's in the White House. I mean, we were in this time period where to talk about oneself as related to race as a white person was extremely rare. And then starting in 2014, when Black Lives Matter first sort of came onto the scene, and then shortly thereafter, there were some really critical conversations happening. The word white privilege became a more household term, plenty of backlash against it, but a household term. The idea of white fragility came on the scene. The language of white supremacy started to become more nationally televised in conversations. None of that had been happening in that earlier edition. And then, of course, during all the teens, the 2010s, we had all of the really political amplification of the far right with a big, huge backlash against more liberal agenda and people of color taking action and asking their voices to be heard and asking not to be killed on the street, and all of these things just really pushed white people to recognize that they needed to enter the conversation on race some kind of way. So how were they going to do it?
You talk about it from your own personal perspective. Because it took you such a long time to transition, you understand there is a need. And as an educator, you understand that there is a way that has to be easier to speak this conversation without throwing guilt. I am such a proponent that if you can bring something with love to the table, everybody's willing to talk. But when we start throwing guilt everywhere, people defenses come up, and the first thing we want to do is like, it wasn't me. Why are you yelling at me? How did you do that with yourself to transition here?
I met a lot of people like you. There are a lot of individuals who were part of my early journey who met me with love. And this was before social media was really at its apex. And so I had the beautiful experience of being with people who could give me the message as resistant as I was without actually shaming me. And that was a really important experience. And in the last maybe decade or so, it's become a lot more common for there to be groups of white people taking responsibility to educate other white people. At the exact same time, there have been people who identify as people of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Latin, whatever the orientation, there's a lot more people who are willing to say, it's not my job to educate you, actually. And in fact, I expect you to go and educate yourself. And so thankfully, I'm in a position where I understand the nuances of that, which is that there are plenty of people who are not white who are willing to still support white people in their growth journey, but we can't expect it. We can't show up saying, well, if you don't want to, then I'm just going to take my chips and go home kind of thing, because there are plenty of resources available and plenty of white affinity groups who are willing to help support. Now, here's the thing, though. I have been gratefully educated in an educator's mind, which means I take seriously the growth and development process, which includes the racial identity development process. And so I'm familiar with what happens along the midpoints. And in the midpoints of our development as white people in race identity development, very often there's a lot of emotion that comes up. And so how do we handle that emotion? And so hopefully we can move people quickly into community with other people who are giving that message that we don't have to stay in the difficult place and we don't need to try to make people feel bad, because there is a place of real goodness and liberation on the other side of that middle place. Think about it, though. There's a lot of people in those middle places on Twitter. So there's a lot of hate stuff and guilt and shame being lobbied and bandied about. And I just find it extremely sad and troublesome. And I think a lot of people are reacting against one another in social media. So that's the challenge that we're facing.
It's a very difficult minefield to navigate. Let's just put it out there. There's no easy term. There is no easy way to look at it. How do you communicate passion, love, and understanding without making somebody be like, by the way, you said, and that's offensive too. So that's huge. My heart goes out to you because this is a huge entire endeavor that you're going, whew, this can be difficult. So let's talk a lot about the book. What can our readers expect when they're going into this? How are you presenting this topic that's a little different than they've seen everywhere else?
Well, what I think the key difference is exactly answering your primary question, which is so much becomes possible when we approach this from a both and perspective. Our regular sort of common culture, everything's either or. Media tells us we're either racist or we're not, that there's some like core aspect of ourselves that's either good or bad. And in truth, things are so much more complicated and nuanced. And that is what my book has that I think keeps it being read by people, which is there are two things that can be true. I can be a really great person. I can be a generous and loving and wonderful person. And because just like everybody else, I have been grown up in our US common culture, it means that racism has fallen all around me all of my life. It's been infused within me in certain kinds of ways that are not because I asked them to be, but because I got socialized into ways of just seeing the world that seem like status quo, unconscious ways of just interpreting what's going on around me. And so I can both deliver a message and receive a message that is, I'm a great person, and so are you. And there's racism all around us, and some of it is like locked up in us, and it's time for us to get it out. So that thing you said, it's got a history, and you didn't know that history. It's not your fault. That's gone in you. And let's work at it, because now that we know, we can be responsible for doing things in a different way.
That is such a powerful statement. And it's being aware and being open to make those conscious decisions. You said it, unconscious bias has become such a huge thing. I have recently joined TikTok for anybody who's like, oh my God, I did that. But one of the things that keeps coming up is problematic writers. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know if they're problematic or they just don't know. What people get very frustrated is how they react when they get pointed out on the problem. For your readers, as they go into this book, are you giving them tips how to handle that? Because that to me is such a huge thing. Like blowing up because somebody calls you on it makes the situation so much worse than just going, oh, wait, what just happened?
Yeah, definitely tips. So the last third of the book is all about, so how do we develop an anti-racist practice? What are the parts of that? And there's 4 different chapters, 4 different sort of key, I think, elements in our recipe. And one of them is capacity building. And the capacity building is not what I hear as often, even though I think there's some really good work happening these days on that, more so than there was 15 years ago. But it really is about our own emotional experience and how we are situated in our bodies, how we experience messages that land in us in a difficult way. And so the somatics element is part of it. I'm not so much of a somatic person. I'm a lot more of a psychology background kind of person. So I'll just say really quickly, this one particular chapter, it has, let's call it about a 10-page elongated analyzed story of a moment when I, as I call it, I went through the fire. I sat with several folks kind of unleashing some pretty challenging material at me. And how did I get through it? How did I kind of use some breathing techniques? How did I use my conscious understanding techniques to not take it personal? And that, I think, is the big important thing that this book allows for. Is in the first parts of it, we're learning history we've never learned before. We're situating ourselves in a dynamic that we didn't even know we were part of. And then in the middle sections, we're meeting people who have struggled and navigated, and all the interview material for my dissertation shows up. And these really interesting people who have, like, they're cross-race pairs who talk about their relationships and where they have stepped on each other's toes and where they're still kind of injured after years of loving and caring about each other. That's the nuance I'm talking about. And so once we get through that, then we're prepared to say, okay, given this history, if I'm out in the world and I step on somebody's toes, how do I hold myself together with that both and understanding, so I'm actually taking care of my emotional self? That just because somebody is coming at me doesn't mean that 100% of what they're saying is necessarily the full scope of the story. But what is the piece of what they're offering that is important that I need to pay attention to and listen to? Because if I'm online and I get a point of difficult feedback, it doesn't erase all the good stuff I'm doing, even if I need to pay attention to the point of critical feedback.
It's all about those critical conversations. And I think it's such a powerful book to bring nowadays and to get people some feedback and get them to see it again and open those conversations. I come from Dominican Republic. So it's interesting to me because race in the United States is such a interesting and controversial issue because we don't have that in Latin America. We're nationalist countries. So at the end of the day, we might have class issues, and there is a color issue to some extent, but not the racial that we have. Because at the end of the day, when somebody asks, "What are you?" You're Dominican, you're Mexican, you're Brazilian, whatever you are. So this conversation is so huge for our culture and the days we are. What advice would you give parents who are now raising kids who are becoming either biracial, bicultural, and are having to face this and they're going, what do I say to my 5-year old? So they don't actually go through the things that I've been going through.
Yeah, I am not a parent, and I'm not a parent of biracial kids. So I am not an expert on that one. That said, there are some things that, as an educator, that I'm aware of. One is that if somebody is a white parent, then getting to understand themselves in this conversation of race is essential, because so many parents, through just loving their kids, just want to go into that. We're all part of the human race, and I'm just going to surround you with love, and I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to try to maintain your innocence. And sometimes that undermines the ability to protect them to what is going to come later, right? On the other hand, if a white parent is kind of in that middle stages of racial identity development, and then they're just mad at white society, then they may or may not be able to actually offer the kind of modeling of what it looks like and what it can be like to be a really healthy anti-racist white person. That also can undermine the ability of their child to relate positively to a big section of the population, and in terms of expectations as well. So, I mean, there are certain books. I know if it's a white parent raising white kids, there's a wonderful book called Raising White Kids that is absolutely spectacular. In terms of raising biracial kids, I would say do your own self-identity process and then reach out. There is a website called Embrace Race, and they have a lot of programming, and a lot of their resources really help support parents of kids of color.
Ooh, we have resources to our listeners that can get you to that step. If you're interested in opening the conversations, let's be honest, It's all about opening the conversations and opening the conversations with an open heart. It's not enough to say we're going to talk about it. If you already think you're coming to the argument and you know all the answers, then it becomes another battle. And it becomes a battle that most of us do not want to fight because it's such a painful process to say we're always fighting. What advice would you give an up and coming author who says, I'm going to go and tackle a subject this in depth and very difficult?
Take your time to really know what you're talking about. What I learned in doing a third edition is that my first two editions, I mean, I think they're good. I still stand by them. And I've learned so much more in the decades, about 15 years since I really wrote that second edition. And there are things that I'm clarifying. And that's why I'm really trying to promote this third edition. I hope people don't read my second edition anymore, because I think the pathway forward in the way that we want, right? Really healthful, separating out things that have gotten conflated, all of that really has taken time for me to understand. And I think specifically for like really complicated subjects, I think, and I'm speaking now as a white person who got trained in a certain way of thinking, which was, oh, I know something now. I want to do something about it. And I want to be a good force. So let me put my word out of what I learned. But if we do that too quickly, then sometimes we're actually not putting out something that's fully cooked. And so the taking of the time is important. And there's a second piece that I'll offer too, which is you asked about intention. And in all honesty, when I wrote this book, the person that was in my head the whole time as I wrote was my father. I really wrote this for my father because throughout my whole journey of learning, my own family dynamic suffered because I felt distanced from my own family members because I was learning this language that they didn't understand. I was starting to act in ways they didn't understand. My priorities were moving and shifting. And I really wanted my family to understand who I had become and why I cared so passionately about this. I say that for two reasons. One is because this book has been used, and I think usefully, as a bridge to connect people who want that loving, generous, how is this going to take me by the hand and lead me into a difficult place? But secondarily, what I didn't really understand was how much community makes a difference. And so within about a year of this book coming out, the second edition, it got really clear to me, both through my own experiences and I started getting a couple of phone calls from others, that it needed to have sort of a curriculum that goes with it. So if you're writing something really complicated, consider whether the best way to use your text is going to be having group processes. I'm not talking about book club silliness. I'm talking about a real like structured process where people can dive in and learn something. And so I've actually spent probably as much time writing. I've spent working in a multiracial collaborative space. And then most recently with a group of like focus group white folks to build an entire curriculum around the book. So every chapter has handouts and agendas that somebody could use to lead their own community through this book. And all of that is free. It's all downloadable on my website. And so church groups, school groups, faculty groups, community groups, friend groups sitting around in their living room can download this thing and know that they are being guided to have real personal conversations, really challenging topic, and get somewhere that is not kind of off in a detour direction.
Powerful advice for anybody who's interested in writing a book that has a social and conscious message. Take your time. It is easy to jump into something very quickly and not being fully prepared. One of the things that I give you from the bottom of my heart is, oh my God, you have tackled a topic that many people are not interested or willing or able to discuss. And as a white female, how much backlash did you get when you put this book together?
Much less than you would imagine.
Oh, thank God. Thank you. That makes me feel better. That's awesome.
I would say the first point of pushback I actually received was the most generous, and I will never forget it. I went to a conference to do a presentation, and I designed it and explicitly said, this, I am talking to white people, because I wanted to make sure that people who were not white didn't feel targeted, like I was, left out or whatnot. And a Black woman came up to me afterwards and she said, don't you ever, ever tell an audience that this isn't useful for everybody, because I was able to take what you offered and translate it and do something with it that I find powerful. So even though I know that I am a white woman who is mostly talking to other white people, I have also led workshop series around this book, most often in a multiracial context. And every single time, there's been at least one person who does not identify as white who has said that it's been a healing process for them. And the reason is because even though I think it's true that people of color, BIPOC folks see race clearer than white folks do, white people know what it's like to be white. We understand the depths of our psyche when we've done the work in a different kind of way. And that's the depth that this book offers, which is why it complements the other books that are out there that are so important to read as well.
It is a great way of showing that if you can come to a culture from the culture and bring the knowledge, it's easier to connect. It is easier from that psychic perspective to people to understand, oh, this is why we do certain things without being attacked, without being, oh my God, you're wrong. And it doesn't matter white, black, Hispanic, whatever you're looking at it, that connection coming from that culture has an opening that most people are not going to be able to do it from the outside. So, absolutely, I love it. What are you working on now?
I actually have a forthcoming book with a co-author. It should be out in June 2023. And the forthcoming title is Being White Today, Roadmap for a Positive Anti-Racist Life. It's complementary, but totally different. So this new book is actually takes the reader and sets up the context of, okay, so for white folks, number one, there's this huge process of identity development. And depending where we are on it, the messages from the far right, particularly hate groups and whatnot, they land in a certain way. And they can be attractive or disruptive in a certain way, depending on where we are on the journey. Similarly, depending on where we're on the journey, the messages from anti-racist and social justice folks land in a certain way. And sometimes they land in ways that are really problematic and don't do what we think they're going to do. And sometimes they're exactly what we need and exactly the right time. And so this book sets the political context, names that white identity is a thing we have to pay attention to. It's being manipulated, and we need to figure out where we land on it. And so we take this tour following characters and their scenarios through the entire racial identity development process while we're exploring how some far right messages are landing and how some anti-racist messages are landing. And at each phase, we're offering, and this is if you're invested in anti-racism and a multiracial democracy, this is maybe the way you could react and support somebody through that process.
Oh, Madame, that is powerful. You know, I can't wait to hear about it. So you have to keep us in touch to our listeners. This is an amazing journey, regardless where you are in the spectrum and where in the world you're listening. So if you're not in the US and you're listening to us across the world, you're going, what does this mean? This is a great book to pick up and just kind of learn, become much more aware and awaken into this movement. So I so appreciate it. Tell me, Madame, where can our listeners find out more about you, about the book? Tell us.
I have so much content on my website. It's shellytochluk.com. That's Shelly with a Y, Shelly, Tochluk, Tochluk.com.
Awesome. And the book is available everywhere. And Madame, before you leave us, typical tradition and Inside the Minds, we got to do the lightning round. Are you ready?
Yes.
Easy peasy. Do not think too much on this. Let's see how you do. Pepsi or Coke?
Pepsi.
Not bad. Sweet or spicy?
Sweet.
Comedy or action?
Comedy.
Okay, not bad. Here's a little off the wall. Snoopy or Scooby Doo?
Oh man. Scooby-Doo.
Okay, you had to
That's
think
my
about that
childhood.
one.
You got into my childhood on that one. I'm Scooby-Doo from childhood.
Getting into your feelings. Let's go that way. So here's one that's a little different. Let's see what you think about this one. If you can pick any character in any movie that best describes your personality, who will you pick?
You know what? I'm going old. And this also fits with a beloved. This is not movie though. This is character from a book. I mean, I think there's a movie now, but I never went and saw it. But I'm going to go with Nancy Drew.
Nice. There's a whole TV series.
I haven't watched any of that, but I'll tell you when, because you love literature and you love stories. When I was 5th grade, I would snuggle up with 2 books over the weekend because Nancy Drew and I graduated into more CIA stuff when I got older, but that character of just being inquisitive and always wanting to know what's that next thing, I think that suits me.
Ooh, I love it. But it has been such a pleasure. Thank you for being with us and thank you for sharing this with our listeners. Do you have any closing remarks?
I just really appreciate having the time to explore this. I am someone who really believes in community. There are even ways to join the communities I'm part of. Go to the website, shellytochluk.com, look at the join the community. I run free regular workshops and host dialogues every month. So white folks who are listening, who want to know how to be anti-racist and be part of a community that is very loving and supportive and ask all those critical questions, we're here for you.
Thank you. To our listeners, make sure to go check out the website, check out the resources available. You're not going to miss out. Make sure to give this episode a like, share it, give us a review. Make sure you know we're always better when we're growing together. And if you're interested in watching the video, make sure to go to my Patreon. You get to see the live unedited version of our conversation. So we'll be back next week with another amazing author, Miss Shelly. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.